right, hello everyone. Welcome to Game of the Day, day number 13 and first day of the finals at the Chessable Masters by Chess24. Our final featuring, of course, Magnus Carlsen, world champion, against Anish Giri, his Twitter rival and friend. And so we had an exciting match today, did not disappoint. The match was tied after Anish won the fourth game with the black pieces. Magnus had won a sort of tricky rook ending that could have been an end game of the day. I decided to do a game of the day instead today, but that rook ending was tricky in the second game. I urge you to check it out. So they find themselves tied after four games, and the first game of the blitz tiebreak ends in a draw. And so Magnus has the white pieces here in game 6. And this is a game I chose because it's an instructive game, actually, even though it's played with a fast time control. 5 minutes each plus increment. I thought it was an instructive game and worth showing. There's also a funny thing that happened here as early as move 4. So let's go ahead here. So it starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Anish, a fairly consistent. He plays different openings, but a Nimzo is certainly one of the main things in his repertoire. And now Magnus plays a3, the same-ish variation, which sort of forces the black bishop to take on c3. In the old days, I don't want to talk too much about things from the 1800s, but in the old days, black would, in the days of Nimzovich actually, black would basically voluntarily take on c3. So the move a3 was kind of considered a bit of a waste of time, forcing black to do something he's going to do anyway. That being said, the move is very interesting, and it leads to fairly sharp positions. There was a couple of very strong grandmasters have made sort of a career out of playing this variation. So it's an interesting one. Black is forced to take because if you retreat with the bishop, then white gets to play e4. So there's really no choice. It's kind of the point of the opening. c5. So black has a few ways to develop, but this is the way that Anish plays here is the most common. Black quickly develops here, fixes the white doubled c-pawns, and eventually they can become targets, right? With either b6, bishop a6, knight c6, a5. Sometimes the knight can come to e8 and d6. There's a few ways that this can happen. c5 is not the only way to play. You can also play a totally different setup with d5 instead of c5 and try to play something like b6 and bishop a6. There's a few different variations, but this one is the most classical. So e3, knight c6, bishop d3, d6, knight to e2. So this is already kind of an interesting setup for white. Again, a few different ways for white to develop, but essentially white wants to play knight g3 and eventually play e4, f4. So it's a pretty aggressive setup. If black wants, they can start very quickly going after the a pawn, play something like castles, then b6, bishop a6, knight a5, and often black will be able to win this pawn. But by the time you do that, white has a menacing center. They're playing bishop to g5, and they're going to attack. So it's a complicated game. Anish plays e5. E5 is a good move. Sometimes you can play e4. It also sort of distracts white by forcing them to pay attention to the center. It's not just letting them control the center. So yeah, very normal move. And now Magnus plays knight g3, which is a move which has only been played a little bit, not very often. So there's castles has been played a lot, but knight g3 is a bit of an unusual move. And Anish's reaction here maybe was not the best. He goes for a very ambitious move, h5. So he's saying, knight g3 is kind of odd. I bet it's because h5 is a good response. And there's a very reasonable positional reason why he's playing h5. As we discussed, white is usually going to end up playing something like e4, probably with d5, just because otherwise this pawn will eventually fall. So they'll play d5 and e4, and you can envision that once they play that, their logical follow-up is to play f4. But by playing h5, Anish is saying, I'm going to threaten h4. So white is going to play h4 himself, and in fact Magnus does. But once Magnus plays h4, he's saying, you know what? If he plays this d5, e5, and f4, I'll always have this beautiful square on g4, which will help me control the e5 square for my knights, and that should be a good trade-off, right? There's a bit of an issue though, and we'll see what the issue is. Magnus does play h4. Anish plays queen e7, very reasonable move. This is very typical of this opening. The queen is eyeing the king here, so we might be threatening to take this pawn. Sometimes white is actually happy to sacrifice it just to open lines, so it's a double-edged sword there. But here Magnus plays d5. And this might already be a critical moment, mostly because of this h5, because in normal circumstances, it might not be the end of the world. But here it seems like Anish might have done well to play the move e4, which is sort of a common mini sacrifice in this kind of position. And when the bishop moves, we probably want to go to b1, because if we go to c2, which is the more natural square, then knight a5 is possible, attacking this pawn. A little bit annoying. On bishop b1, it's a nice little tactical point. We can't play knight a5 because we have this check, something to remember here. Queen a4 check. So bishop b1 is maybe a little more precise. And then black can play knight e5 or knight d8, really, if they don't feel like dealing with this. Knight d8 is possible. And it seems like this e4 move might actually give black decent chances. White's going to play f3. It's still going to be a complicated game. But it was interesting to play this way. And knight e5 is also interesting, eyeing the c4 pawn. Messy game. However, after knight b8, white plays e4. Now, already I think Anish's position is surprisingly difficult because this bishop is coming to g5, and this is a major drawback of having h5 played. Normally, you could just play h6, kick it out, and it's no big deal. But in this case, once the bishop gets to g5, this is going to be a disastrous spin. And if you play knight to d7, white can land on f5, which, it might not win outright, but it's certainly very unpleasant, especially in a blitz game. So already this position I don't love for black. The next few moves sort of show that. He plays bishop g5. He played bishop g4, by the way, to provoke f3 so that this pawn wouldn't be attacked twice, right? So that's the idea. He didn't just waste a tempo. But here already he feels compelled to get out of the pin, after which the position is already pretty bad for black. But the way Magnus plays here is very instructive. First of all, he makes a move that not everyone would necessarily play. He plays castle. It's a move that shows good understanding because he's not worried about the fact that the g file is open against the king, and he's preparing to play f4. And it's just a really good move. Knight d7. Now he plays f4 anyway, and this is again, a move that shows great understanding by Magnus, even though this is a blitz game. The idea is that after pawn takes f4, he can take on h5, and even though he's giving up the e5 square, he's getting more than enough because he's going to have so much play on this f file that this position is already quite difficult for black. Knight e5. So Anish decides to sacrifice the f pawn. Doesn't want to get steamrolled after rook f4. The queen moves, the other rook comes to f1. So he plays knight e5, knight f6, king d8, rook f4, knight g6. Now this is the next very important moment where Magnus makes a great move, because the natural move to, let's say, go back with the rook after rook takes h4, it's actually not very clear. Even though the king on d8 might look funny to you, black has a simple plan of playing something like queen e7, queen e5, start attacking, themselves. And, it doesn't look really all that bad for black. The king, this is actually quite common in a Nimzo. You could put your king on c7 and it could feel very, very safe suddenly. So look at what Magnus does here. Very instructive move. He plays queen to f3. Now, this is a great move. He's saying, you know what? This rook is less important than the knight. And in reality, he just wants to cement this knight on f6. And after that, you can see that he can play h5, g4. It's really a very, very strong position after this. So Anish plays queen e7. Oh, I did want to show a variation here. What happens if black takes this pawn on h4? It's actually poisoned. It's a little sort of mini tactical variation here. We play rook takes h4, rook takes, queen to g3. The rook is attacked, and we want to come to g8. So the rook goes back to h8, and now queen g7, and we're covering all of the squares here. Therefore, it's just lost here. After rook e8, for example, I'll show you the most precise very quickly. Rook f1, and we're crashing through. On bishop moves, we can either take the rook or play queen g5 check. So, and of course, our threat is rook f7. So, yeah, so Anish plays queen e7, tries to keep things under control. He's trying to bring his king to c7, but he doesn't quite get there. h5. And now Anish took the rook. Maybe knight e5 was a better chance. The problem is that now really the knight is the only good thing about black's position, because white is going to be able to play like queen g3, rook f1, maybe queen g7, h6. There's just there's just not a lot for black here. The knight on f6 is just too strong. So he's like, you know what? At least I'll be up in exchange. And they go into the endgame. G4, strong move, cementing everything. He doesn't let his knight be kicked out. G4 is important because he'll be able to play G5 and defend that knight. A5, a good try actually. He's trying to bring the rook in the game, and that's by far the quickest way to bring it into the game. So a nice move. And G5 played by Magnus, good move too. Rook A6. And now Magnus made a rare mistake because he had a simple move that I think in most, with a little bit more time on the clock, he would for sure play. He sort of missed Anish's idea, I think, or underestimated it. Bishop E2 would have been a strong move defending the pawn on H5. And this is important because he plays Rook B1, very logical. He's stopping the other idea, which is Rook B6. But now Anish is able to sacrifice the exchange back. That's one of the things that is said a lot by grandmasters about being up the exchange. One of the best things about being up the exchange is that you can give it back. And so this is one example of that. And after pawn takes, rook takes H5, even though white is up a pawn right now, he's got 6. Still a little hard to count them because they're so weirdly placed. 6 on 5. It's not an easy endgame because white's pawns here are doubled, and you can see that this one could fall versus one of these, and not necessarily clear. In fact, black's probably pretty close to equal here. But Magnus starts setting real problems here again for black. By the way, the position with bishop e2 is probably close to winning for white, just to clarify that. All right, so he plays, after rook takes h5, he plays rook b5. Rook h3, good move. Bishop e2. Rook takes e3. Actually, well, one thing we should mention here is, and they talked about this after the game a little bit, it's possible rook h6, taking this one, would have been a better way to go here. And he actually has a check first, and which kind of forces the king to either go here or here. If you go to f2, then we take with check, but you don't really want to go to h2, which cuts it off. And so here, the rook can come to f3 next, and black is probably closer to equal than to being worse. So we can get a position like this, and it's not an entirely clear endgame. White probably is still to be preferred, but it's not over at all. But Anish went for rook h3, maybe not bad. He takes this one, rook a5. But this is where I think was maybe sort of his last chance, where he could play rook g3 check and eliminate this pawn. And by eliminating one more pawn, this f6 pawn, it looks like he would be a little bit closer to potentially holding. It's still a position that optically looks not so easy for black to hold, but it would have been a better chance. After rook e3, this position actually gets kind of fascinating here. Bishop h5. So Magnus is able to take the f7 pawn here, which is f7 pawn, and combining with the bishop having some issues. So the position is not easy here for black. In fact, probably lost already. So yeah, quickly things turn around. Now there's a real problem. I mean, white is threatening to just play bishop f7 followed by bishop e6. And so king c7 is the only move to get out of this kind of nasty pin. But now white has a really strong move, d6. And what this does is that it forces the king to a horrible square. This is the worst square, right? Because it blocks the bishop, but there's no other move. And so now he plays bishop f7, creating a passed f pawn. And it's very hard for black to get out of this sort of silly formation with the king and bishop. So he plays rook g4 check, king h2, rook f4. Sort of the only way to try to get the pawn. And now king g3, strong move. He's preparing the next move, which happens after rook takes f6. Bishop h5. And so this odd formation, now he's forcing bishop g4, and there's really not a good defense here for black. So he plays rook f4, bishop g4, king takes d6, bishop takes c8, and we get into an endgame where white is up a piece, and now it's just a matter of good technique, and Magnus certainly has very, very good technique. Makes it look easy. We'll just kind of walk through this quickly because it's not there's not too much analysis required here. But Magnus always makes it look easier than someone else might, to be fair. So now he's actually won this pawn, and he's going to be able to win the other one too. So it's completely over. So with this, Magnus won the first match of this finals, and he can clinch tomorrow if he wins the match, or they will come back for a third match on Sunday. I'm confused with my days because it's a weird holiday weekend. Happy 4th of July celebrations to the American fans out here. So with that, that concludes the game of the day. I will see you all for more tomorrow.